I can't tell you the exact tools and equipment you will need to change the oil in your particular car with your particular location, but I want to give you enough information so that you can make good decisions. Perhaps along the way, I can save you some money or time or frustration with the tools. First, I'm going to show tools that are absolutely necessary for any situation. Second, there are some tools that are probably required or might be necessary in your particular situation. You want to look at those carefully. And then third, there are some tools and equipment that would be nice to have and make things go a little bit easier. Where I live, every auto parts store will accept used oil. You may need to call ahead to see if they do that in your area as well. I can also use the county hazardous waste locations. There's two that aren't real close by, but sometimes I use those as well. Sometimes you can remove an old oil filter just using your hands, but a lot of times you're going to need a tool to remove the oil filter. I like this oil filter removal tool. Usually you can use it from the side like this and unscrew the oil. By the way, these are only used for removing the oil filter, but the angled version like this that I have can also be used on the top. If you grab it on the top, you can get enough purchase to twist it off like this. So this is a very versatile tool, just an oil change pliers. I do like this version. The one I've been using lately, however, is this one. It's got three little wings here and it adjusts to the size, and you use a ratchet, put it in the ratchet, and you can tighten it like that. And I've found this is very, very good for removing it. I bought this particular one at Walmart for about $3 or $4, and because there's no inflation, it's now like $6. To remove the oil drain plug, you're going to need a socket with a ratchet or a box end wrench. A socket is probably best for removing your oil plug. In my case, it's a 14mm socket. Of course, you're going to need a ratchet to attach to that to be able to remove it. Sometimes they can be stubborn. You can use a bigger one. Here's a 1/2-inch socket wrench and the same size, 14mm. And so this would give you a little bit more leverage to remove the oil plug. If you're on a real tight budget, you can also use a box end wrench like this. By the way, never use the open end for this. Use the box end because you'll strip it out with the open end. This works fine. You just get it on there and you can remove it. And it's cheaper. If you're just buying one wrench, it's cheaper. But you probably, if you want to start doing car work, investing in a good socket and ratchet set would probably be a good idea. You will need an oil drain container, and this one was on the thumbnail. It's really big. I've used this oil container a lot. It does hold the oil, and it does have little screw caps. It doesn't completely seal, but it's enough to get this oil to the recycling location. Since I installed a Fumuro oil valve, I usually use this container to drain the oil and take it to the recycling location. You wouldn't want to do this with regular oil plug because it sprays all over the place and you can't get it right in the container. You can even use one of these plastic storage bins. Just make sure it's big enough to fit all the oil that you need to drain out, and make sure it's low enough so that it actually fits underneath your car. The oil drain plug will not properly seal the oil just by itself. You need a gasket, or a lot of times we call it a crush washer. There are all kinds of ways that people use to seal the bolt against there to make sure it doesn't leak any oil. These two are plastic. Never use those. Yeah, don't like those. This one is like steel with a rubber insert, and it probably works. If you're going to use something like this, I definitely oil that rubber seal before you install it. Yeah, that'd probably work, although not my favorite. My favorite is to use what the OEM uses, and they usually use either a copper or an aluminum crush washer. These should be used only once, although there's plenty of people that reuse the things. If you buy them online, you can probably get them really, really cheap. For example, the OEM one on my car looks like this. It is copper, but it's a little bit tighter. I got to actually screw it in. And it fits just like that. And this one I can get on Rock Auto in bulk, 10 a piece for $1.89. So I can get them really, really cheaply. There's no sense in trying to reuse it. I just use a new one every time. For most safety, you're going to need a firm, level surface to change your oil, like a garage floor, a concrete garage floor, or asphalt. You will also need some old clothes. I guarantee you're going to get oil and dirt on your clothes, so wear some old clothes. Ramps are one method to change oil, to get the car off the ground. Now, my specific vehicle that I currently own is high enough off the ground that I can get under there without even jacking up the car or putting it on ramps, but your car might be lower to the ground, so you might need to get the car up. All you need to do is drive up on the ramps. Be careful. Some of the plastic ramps that they sell nowadays are good quality. Others I've seen a lot online that have broken. So do your research. Buy ramps of good quality that aren't going to break. The best way to change oil is to have the car level. You can jack up the back of the car and put it on jack stands after it's been put on the ramps. I use a floor jack to lift my car when I need to lift it off the ground, and I use some jack stands. Now, the floor jack that I have, it was fairly expensive. You can get by with a less expensive floor jack sometimes, and you can get by with a trolley jack. The difference usually is how high it lifts. The floor jack lifts quite high, but my car's high off the ground. I need it to lift pretty high. If you have a smaller car, it's lower to the ground. A trolley jack might do the trick and get you by less expensively. Jack stands usually get what you pay for, but I've seen inexpensive jack stands that are actually quite good. When you jack your car up on jack stands, you're going to need to chock the wheels so that they don't move. You can use a block of wood, but I like these rubber wheel chocks that I got at Harbor Freight. They're much better than the old plastic ones that I had when I first started doing this. Also, because the surface that you are using your jack and or jack stands on might not be perfect, you might need some wood or lumber to go under things. I use a piece of wainscoting to go underneath my floor jack, and that works fine for me because the concrete surface that I use is a bit rough. The wainscoting just smooths it out a little bit. It does get somewhat damaged, but it's going to last for several more years before I need to replace it. You could also use a piece of plywood. Jack stands are also an issue when you have a soft surface like gravel or asphalt, especially asphalt when it's warm outside and it's fresh asphalt, because the jack stands tend to sink in, and that's terrible. If you have your car up, you don't want anything sinking in and potentially tipping over. So putting a piece of plywood under the jack stand is a good idea. The home stores in my area sell these 2x2 plywood sheets, and if you cut these into fourths, you'll have the perfect plywood platform to put your jack stands on. Sometimes the oil drain plug will be very difficult to remove, in which case you might need a breaker bar or a hammer. For bolts that are difficult to remove, you can use something like this breaker bar. This happens to be a 1/2-inch breaker bar, and it's very long, so it allows you to get a lot of torque on a bolt to remove it. A few years ago, I bought this ratchet. It's a 3/8" ratchet. It's not very expensive, but it has a little trick. If I pull that, I can extend it into kind of a breaker bar, and this has worked very good. When I need a 3/8" with a little bit more torque, it works fine and hasn't broken yet. If you're using a heavy-duty ratchet like this, or preferably your box end wrench, you can use a hammer to hammer on the end of it to give you a little bit more chance to get that thing off. By the way, make sure you're twisting in the right direction before you do this. And you want a big hammer. This one, not big enough, too small. That's not enough weight. Even this one, not big enough, and I wouldn't use a nail hammer for something like this. So this is not a good hammer to use. This is getting closer to the mark. That's a much heavier hammer. This one would probably work pretty good, but my preferred hammer when I do this is this one here. It's got a much heavier head. It's got a kind of a short handle, and just a short little tap can give you a lot of force. So this is what I use when I have to tap to remove something that's stuck. Now, you do risk the danger there of rounding off the bolt or breaking something, so be really cautious with that. But, you know, there is that old saying, if at first you don't succeed, then use a bigger hammer. Paper towels are nice to have. I like these blue shop towels, but you can use the white ones as well. It doesn't really matter. I just like the texture better on the blue shop towels. I've seen people that are good enough to put the oil in the engine without spilling, but for most of us, a funnel is a good idea and it's a very cheap option. I've used this funnel for years and years to put oil in my car. Make sure when you get a funnel that the opening isn't too small because oil needs to flow through there. This one's about as small as you want to get, but it works fine. I bought this one at the dollar store. Might have a little bit of a long tube there, but it'd probably still work. And yeah, just you don't have to spend a lot on a funnel. I just bought this funnel and it wasn't too expensive. I think it was about $4. And it has a nice big opening here that's specifically made to fit into the spot where you put the oil. And I like this shape because it's made so that it covers the splashes and gets everything down where it needs to go. Oil comes in two different size containers. Most people buy it in the quart bottles like this, but it also comes in these 5-quart bottles. And this 5-quart bottle is much cheaper than buying 5 individual quarts. But you have to measure it and get the right amount of oil into your car. You can do that. There are markings on the side on both types of containers, and you can do it with those markings. But I prefer to use this pitcher and this measuring cup that I bought at the dollar store. And that works better so I can get the right amount of oil in there. By the way, on any of these plastic things that I mentioned that are clear, you want the kind of cloudy clear plastic like this, not the really crystal clear plastic that's rigid, because it tends to break and it can break down with some of the car chemicals that you might be using. To clean up, you're going to use paper towels probably, but it's also nice to have some brake cleaner. Here's some from FVP, some from CRC. This is the name brand. It's a little more expensive. It really doesn't matter. Buy whichever one. It doesn't really matter the brand, but I would get the non-chlorinated brake cleaner because it's not quite as bad for you. And speaking of bad for you, that brake cleaner and other auto chemicals are really nasty on your hands and can cause issues with health later on. So I always use gloves. I usually buy these blue nitrile gloves at Harbor Freight, but this year Harbor Freight came with a new color, so I bought the green nitrile gloves for an extra $1 per box. Yeah, I just spent a little extra money. Harbor Freight seems to be the best price on nitrile gloves. You can use latex gloves as well. I do not like vinyl gloves for car work because they're just not as good and they can deteriorate possibly with some of the chemicals. You may also want to have some safety glasses. I never use them when I'm changing oil, but you may want to protect your eyes, especially if you're new to this game. You may also want to put an oil change reminder note on the car after you're done. You could be cheap and just use a piece of tape written on with some marker, and that will work sufficiently. Or if you have a very picky person that you were changing the oil for that doesn't like things in their car, you could put a nice friendly note in the glove compartment. Or you could do what I did and buy some oil change stickers on Amazon and fill those in so you can remind yourself to change the oil.